And welcome everyone to this first page speed webinar. We're seeing loads of people still joining, so we'll take a few moments to wait for them so they're not missing important information, because as I just said in the chat, today will be fast.
It is going to fly by.
Oh yeah. If you have a question, there is a Ask a Question button at the bottom, and you can ask your question there. And also you can upvote others' questions. So if you see a question that you really would like the answer to as well, please use the upvote, because that's the order we'll take the questions in until we run out of time by the end of the evening, or morning, or afternoon, or middle of the night, depending on where you are.
I was just thinking, we've got so many people from so many different places in the chat, and I've just spotted our friend Milan, who's just said, hello for my honeymoon. That is some commitment.
Wow. Yes, that is dedication.
Awesome.
Loving it.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we're ready to get started. As you probably saw in the announcement, I'm just here to be pretty. Your speaker for today will be Jono Alderson, the one and only, the famous technical SEO from, well, let's just say everyone knows him. But he's here live today from the UK. Please give a big hand in the chat for Jono Alderson.
Thank you very much, Taco. Lovely, very nice. There are so many people here. Right, so we've got a lot to get through, so this is going to be quite fast. I want to get through all of the boring informational stuff and spend as much time as possible answering your questions and helping you out with specific problems. So let's do a quick bit of housekeeping. Today's plan, I want to talk to you about why speed matters, introduce you to core web vitals, Google's new metrics, which everyone is very excited about, give you some insight into how you might go about measuring and optimizing your core web vitals scores, give you some tips, tricks, tools, WordPress techniques, etc. I want to think a little bit about AMP, which you might not have come across, so we'll get onto that. And then we'll have all the Q&A we have time for. I'm willing to keep going for hours through the night. We'll see who stays up the longest and manages to get through as many slides as possible. So very quickly, I guess. You will hear, you know about Yoast, you know what we do. We do SEO software, best known for our SEO plugin for WordPress. If you're not using that, definitely go check it out. I work for Yoast in a role loosely known as special ops, which means I do a whole bunch of research and development and product ideation. More housekeeping very quickly. So ask questions throughout, use the Q&A functionality. We will round them up and tackle them at the end. The webinar is going to be recorded. It will be available on yoast.com at some point in the coming days and weeks. All of the slides I'm going to show you, even though you'll only see them quickly in some cases, all have resources. There are links all the way through this, so when you get the recordings and the final deck, you can go through and look on your own time. And for all of this, if you feel lost or stuck, don't forget that Yoast SEO Academy has a whole bunch of content on speed and performance optimization, and so does our blog and all of our site stuff. So go look around and backfill anything that feels a little bit ungrounded. So let's start with why speed matters. Google announced that site speed would be part of their algorithm as far back as 2010. In fact, they announced it in 2009 and then launched it in 2010. And they said at that time that they'd realized that delays of under half a second, so less than half a second, could tangibly impact business metrics. 500 milliseconds could cost you bottom line. What does that look like? Well, they released a whole bunch of research, which I apologize, this is not a pretty slide, but this is from 2010. This shows that the speed that a web page loads at has a direct impact on user engagement, on satisfaction when you survey people, and on conversion rate, on the number of people who buy the thing. Tiny differences count. The difference between 200 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds can cost you 1% of revenue. Think about, like, that's no time at all and huge amounts of money. Because people get consciously annoyed, or more likely, they get unconsciously distracted or disengaged, or they look out the window, or they change tab, because this is no longer a singular task that they're performing. They've got to wait, and that's uncomfortable. In fact, we see loads of this research. We can see from Wired magazine in 2014 that half of the people who visit your site expect it to load in under 2 seconds. And over the years since then, that was a long time ago, we've seen more and more research that users expect things to be fast. For example, from 2016, Google discovered that delays of over 3 seconds could lead to nearly half of your people abandoning your cart or the transaction process. When things aren't fast, people give up. We are burning money. Milliseconds burn money. So, based on that, you would expect us all to have lightning fast websites, right? Well, unfortunately not. Again, this isn't the prettiest table, but hopefully I can talk you through it. This shows from 2018 how long it takes for websites to load on a 3G mobile connection on average. And that's broken down by industry and by country. And you can see they're all color-coded red for a reason. Most sites are slow. Lots of these sectors on average take 10 seconds to load. Remember that half our audience expect our site to load in 2 seconds and half of them will leave after 3 seconds. We're burning money. So Google really keeps pressing on this. In 2018, they got much more serious about pushing for site speed. They said that if your site was really slow, slower than your competitors, that would start to hurt your rankings and your visibility. And this went on. They'd say also in 2018, they'd started to provide some tools and documentation on how you might manage and improve your speed, because at the time, site speed was still very complex, very new as a kind of discipline, and the technologies and standards were changing and evolving all the time. However, unfortunately and unhelpfully, when Google provided or linked to resources like they do here, they tended to be quite hard to digest. Many were extremely technical, and they certainly weren't aimed at average webmasters running websites and managing businesses. In fact, if I just animate this slide and watch it scroll down, you can see how dense and how technical this documentation is. This isn't helpful, it's not accessible, there's no easy checklist or starting place, and there are lots of complicated concepts, which if you're just starting to explore this, are probably going to be a bit overwhelming. I know some of them still are for me, and I've been deep in this since I was yay high. So there was a big explosion in the market for lots of tools which measured, monitored, and scored your site performance. They all provide grades and metrics and overviews, like this one, for example, or this one, which provides different metrics and some more technical grades and overviews and scores and outlines, and this one, which visualizes how individual assets on my page load, but does so in a different way to all the other tools. You see, there's quite a lot of fragmentation here. And meanwhile, speed is getting more and more important whilst many sites are still slow. In fact, this was research from just the other week. Shopify found that 57% of shoppers, people who are actively looking to buy things, have said that they will leave a site if it's slow and go buy from a faster competitor. So there's clearly a problem here. And a big part of that problem is that many businesses and website owners don't really know where to start, or don't even know that they need to start, or they don't know that they're losing potential customers, because this is all complicated and hard to digest and hard to access. So Google want webmasters to make their sites faster, because a faster website, faster internet is a better internet for users and for Google, etc. But the metrics, the measurements, the tools, and the processes are confusing, complicated, ever-changing. Core Web Vitals is the beginning of Google solving that problem, of standardizing the way that we measure speed and providing consistent tools and education and processes and metrics. Exciting, right? We have measurements. Core Web Vitals are part of what Google refers to as page experience and the page experience measurement ecosystem. They sit alongside existing ranking factors which provide a good foundation. Things like being on HTTPS and being secure, of having a mobile-friendly website, of not using intrusive interstitials. A page which delivers a good experience now also has to meet these Core Web Vitals metrics: loading, interactivity, and visual stability. We'll explore these in just a minute, but these all bundle together to deliver this idea of what does a good experience look like. Now, we're focusing on this today, and the reason why this is a bit more urgent and a bit more important is because in May, those Core Web Vitals scores will be ranking factors. they'll be included in determining where your pages rank and when they rank and against which other pages. So what are they? Core Web Vitals are a new set of metrics for measuring user experiences, mostly and particularly speed at the moment, but more areas in the future. It's something worth considering. They monitor real user experiences on your site by collecting data from everybody using Chrome browsers, for example, as well as using synthetic lab tests where they measure using tools and simulations to try and understand how your pages load. If you pass, if you get good enough scores in these areas, you get a ranking boost. Not a huge one, not an enormous one, one small factor amongst many hundreds of others, maybe thousands of others, thousands of things they assess and consider when they look at your pages and your competitors' pages. And certainly not as important as relevance, which is the quality of your content, the authority of your brand, etc. But passing Core Web Vitals could be the tiebreaker between you or another site or another page ranking if it's that bit slower. This is worth investing in, especially if you're not very fast yet, if only because we know that it correlates so well with direct conversion outcomes and revenue. The SEO side is almost a side effect, but this is going to become more and more important. It's worth flagging as well that we're really thinking and talking about mobile user experiences here. Google is gradually changing to perceive the world in a mobile-first way, maybe even a mobile-only way. Most sites are now crawled and indexed from a mobile-first perspective. So when we start thinking about performance and user experience and quality metrics, we really need to be thinking about that in the context of mobile devices. Small screens, flaky network connections, slow loading, limited bandwidth, limited CPU, limited graphics processing power. All of these things are constrained. Okay, let's break this down. Core Web Vitals, loading, interactivity, visual stability. Each of these comes with a specific metric and some technical definitions. The first of these is largest contentful paint. And again, remember, I've got links to all of the documentation here on these slides. You can see at the bottom, there's a link. And when you get a hold of these, you can go through and look yourself. Largest contentful paint is the length of time it takes for the biggest thing on the page to finish loading. Kind of does what it says on the tin, right? In many cases, on an e-commerce site, that might be the product image. On a lead generation site, that might be a big banner image in the homepage. It's that largest thing, and Google monitors and measures how the page loads, because the moment that's done, you can kind of understand what the page is about. On a newspaper site, it might be the headline of an article. So if you're loading a huge image immediately on screen, you're going to need to put some effort into making sure that's not your weak point. And you can see in this diagram just about that there are thresholds for good, needs improvement, and poor, and different amounts of time that you're allowed to have that happening. So anything under 3.5 seconds is okay, but that 3.5 to 4 is maybe a problem area. On Yoast.com, yep, you can see we're guilty of this. We're loading a big image right above the fold. That is the largest element on the page. And when we get scored on largest contentful paint, that's the element that's being measured. And in fact, slightly naughty, don't go look, but we need to do better at managing the size and quality of that image, and maybe even change the file format and look at ways that we can make that load faster. Everything else can happen next, but we want to try and do some juggling to really prioritize that image loading quickly. The second metric is first input delay. What does that mean? When I'm on my phone and I try and press a button or open a drop down or scroll or slide or tap a thing, it needs to respond instantly. It shouldn't do nothing, or it shouldn't jitter and jerk as it tries to process what I'm doing but isn't quite ready yet. That sort of thing happens when the page is still loading, and it's a really unpleasant experience for a user. Even as the page is still loading, when I start to scroll and interact with it, that should be fluid. And again, you can see in the image that there are time thresholds on how long it's okay for that not to happen for. So it's okay if it takes 100 milliseconds for my page to start to react, but anything more than that, users are going to get frustrated. And remember, that costs us SEO, it costs us time, it costs us money, etc. What does that look like? I've just described that, but as you tap on this, it should react instantly. If there's lots of stuff going on with CSS and JavaScript, that might prevent the page from reacting immediately. So here, we need to be thinking on Yoast, what's the bare minimum we can load here? do we really need to be loading all the JavaScript which powers the the comment form at the bottom of the page, for example? Does the comment form really need to be loaded now, or can we load it later? That sort of stuff can wait. We can start to manage that. The third metric is cumulative layout shift. This one is best described with a GIF. We've all experienced this. I'm going to move forward and show you what this looks like. As I go to press the thing, something else loads in and it moves it out the way. Nightmare, so frustrating. Something like an image or an ad pops in and pushes everything else down, or pushes it around, or pushes it off screen, or moves it up. This is a huge pain point for users, pain point even. What we're aiming to do here is construct the page in such a way that the browser knows about everything that's going to load. Nothing is a surprise. If we're going to load an image in the content, we tell the browser to reserve the space for that so that all the text on the page doesn't reflow as it has to load. This is important for two reasons. One is it's freaking annoying as a user, but two, it's really expensive computationally to be redesigning a page as bits of it load. That takes graphics cards, it takes CPUs, it takes electricity, it takes overhead that might impact other metrics. All of that is quite complex. So the combination of how well you do in these three areas, on these three metrics, gives you an overall score. You need to pass on all of them to be eligible for any potential ranking boost. This is something I touched on earlier. It's the mobile score that's really important. So when I come on to looking at testing tools and things in a moment, when you get the choice between looking at desktop and mobile, and I know some of you have had some questions on this, we'll get to it, you really want to be looking at the mobile experience, because the internet connection won't be as good. There'll be less RAM, less CPU, they're throttled to emulate poor weather conditions and all sorts of stuff. Don't tell anyone, it's pretty easy to score 100% on desktop, relatively speaking. It is nightmarishly hard to score over 90 on mobile. That's where we really need to be focusing. So how do we do it? Once upon a time, there were a million tools for measuring page speed. The only one which reliably and consistently is from the horse's mouth, is the direct source of the truth, is Page Speed Insights. This is a Google tool that behind the scenes uses a piece of software called Lighthouse, which you might have heard of, which is the open source software which they use to do all this measurement. So this is Page Speed Insights is a tool on top of Lighthouse. It's by Google. It ties into all these metrics. It's really good at giving you an overview of the latest and clearest version of how all of this works. It looks something like this, at least the results do. And this is Yoast.com for a mobile result. And maybe you can immediately see that there are some problems here. And I will forgive our team that we have a complex business with a complex website, not as many web developers as we would like to employ in a perfect world, who have a big, long to-do list, and bits of speed are in there, but we've got 10 years of website to unpick. So our website isn't perfect, but we're working on it, and these kinds of tools make it much easier to do that. So let's do a bit of self-diagnosis. We get an overall score out of 100. And that is color-coded into red, orange, or green based on the score thresholds below. You can see that really we need to do a bit of work to get out of that poor zone and into the good zone if we're going to be eligible for that ranking boost. Move down a little bit. We get a section here called field data. Now, as I mentioned before, this is data from real humans using your website over the last 30 days. So if you make a change today, it might take a bit of time for that to show up. This is data collected from users using Chromium browsers, which is Google Chrome and a couple of others, who have opted into their history settings, I think. So there's some kind of passive analytics going on in the background. This gives us 3 metrics plus 1. So we've got our largest contentful paint, the first input delay and cumulative layout shift, and also first contentful paint, which, if you remember, largest contentful paint, can probably work out what it means. It's how long it takes to get something onto the screen. That's not one of the main 3 metrics, but it's often a good way of seeing where there's problems and issues. What's really useful here is we get a little breakdown. If I skip forwards, here we go. This is split into percentage ranges. Again, remember, this is the last 30 days from real humans. We can see that for 16% of our visitors, the first contentful paint was bad. That's concerning. Like, we might start to ask, who are those 16%? Do we have good enough support for very old mobile phones? Are we doing a good job of sending a very fast server response to users on a different continent from where our hosting is? There is a small subset of people there who get a genuinely bad experience using our site. So we need to be focusing on doing that. This is why the mobile view is more important, because anybody on a desktop on a good Wi-Fi connection is probably going to be in those green areas. But the people who need the site to be fast, you really need it to be in order to use it and to maybe buy things from you, quite often struggle. Scroll down a little bit. This is data collected by the testing tool, the lab synthesized data. This is trying to emulate real users, but it's not quite the same thing. This is scanning from my browser and trying to emulate and understand what's going on. It has some different metrics which you can dive into and look at in more depth, which are really useful for diagnosing where you might have issues and what kind of problems you might have. Changing these won't impact your score. Remember, the score is from real humans aggregated over time and pages, but this is really helpful for measuring and monitoring and understanding where there are problems. Again, everything is color-coded. You can expand it out. What's really nice is if you're on WordPress, if I move forwards a little bit, you can see in this screen that they detect you're running WordPress and give you some sort of specific WordPress advice on how you might fix your problems. Usually there's a plugin for this, go and have a look, but that's quite cool. This is showing me opportunities, and this is specific areas where the testing tool has found that there are bottlenecks and slow things. And you can see here in this example that let me make my screen a bit bigger so I can actually see the text. We need to eliminate render blocking resources. And that, I appreciate, that might sound incredibly alien. But you can click on this, you can go do some reading, you can explore, and you can learn what this means. What's important is there is half a second, 0.55 seconds going against this problem. This isn't enough to start a diagnosis. Now we can talk to developers, we can do a bit of sleuthing, try and work out what's going on. A little bit below there, you can start to see, I've clicked out of my thing, there we go, specific examples of the problems it's found. Here we can see we are loading a lot of CSS and JavaScript. You don't need to be a developer to see that particularly. You can start to spot clues like the .css in the file name, and you can see these are chunky files that take a long time to download. What's interesting here is that some of these aren't big files. You see the first one is only 1.4 kilobytes. That's tiny, but it's taking a long time to download. The problem here is that they're render blocking. These prevent other resources from being loaded until they're finished. We've created a bottleneck. If we fix these, we could save 150 milliseconds, which is probably worth us spending an afternoon doing. Now, these examples will differ by every site, and the solutions will differ by every site. We'll come on to some examples of what that might look like for you in a bit. But the important thing here is these are clues for where you can look and the kind of problems you might want to solve. There's a really obvious one you can see just below the one I've highlighted. Remove unused CSS. That's my doorbell. Very exciting. I wonder who that is at this time of night. Never mind. My lovely wife, Sam, who some of you know, will go and get that now. In the meantime, we should reduce our reliance on unused CSS. We're not using it. It's not there for a reason. Let's get rid of it. Then we don't have to load it. If we scroll down further, we get past opportunities into diagnostics. This is where we can get really technical and start to nerd out a bit. Now, you don't have to be a developer or understand what script evaluation is to spot that this is a problem. Now, again, you can click the learn more and go do a bit of reading. And it turns out that script evaluation just means reading and processing JavaScript. And if you think back 2 seconds, we already spotted that we load a lot of JavaScript on Yoast. Turns out we're also spending a lot of time processing that JavaScript. We've got 2 problems with our JavaScript. If we just fixed our JavaScript, we'd make things a lot faster. Maybe not as easy said as done, but you get the idea. It's a bit painful looking at URLs one at a time doing this. So handily, Google provides a report in Google Search Console that I've linked to down the bottom, which gives you aggregated scores for desktop and mobile over time, which is really handy. And when you dig into these reports, I don't think I have a slide for this, but when you press open report, they group URLs into similar pages automatically. So you will find all of your product pages or all of your about pages or all of your blog posts. And it gives you examples and you can drill down into those. If your chart looks something like this one, you probably have an issue. You can see the desktop scores are mostly okay-ish, but getting a bit worse, and there's some bad ones. The mobile's concerning. Most of the mobile pages are poor, and there are no good ones. There are only poor or bad. So if yours looks like this, again, just go have a look in Search Console. You know that you really ought to do something about it. Okay, so that's a lot to digest. what do you do? What can you do? How do you do it? Where do you start? Let's look at some examples. What is the secret to optimizing your core Web Vitals scores? Well, the secret is two sets of things. There are some easier things you can do. They are to use good hardware. And in our ecosystem, that really boils down to hosting, which we'll come on to in a minute. Use good software, which, yay, WordPress, but also your themes and your plugins can play a big part in this ecosystem. Load less stuff. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that loading less stuff means loading faster. And load smaller stuff. So where we can, swap big things out for small things, or where we can't, try and find ways to make them smaller. And then there's some harder stuff, which we'll explore as well. Don't load external stuff. If your website is relying on things like Google Fonts, for example, and you're loading resources from other domains, it's very hard to make that fast because servers have to communicate with other servers. They are limited by the speed of light and various security protocols, and there's only so fast you can make this. It's almost universally better to host all of your stuff yourself on your own domain, which is a relatively new thing. Some years ago, best practice might have been to use external content delivery networks for things like Google Fonts and jQuery and others. That's no longer best practice, and we'll explore some of the implications of that. Also, you can cache everything. You can cache your server responses, you can cache your resources in users' browsers, you can stop things from having to be sent twice. Now, quite often, this won't make them faster immediately. It won't fix your problems, but it might patch over it. We'll come on to that in a minute. The order that you load things in can make quite a big difference. And actually, the PageSpeed Insights tool is quite good for this. You want to be managing whether your CSS loads before your JavaScript or vice versa. The WordPress and queue system handles this quite gracefully, so that's pretty good. And then really the ultimate secret and all of the hard work where you start to make the real rewards is to really interrogate every bit of CSS and JavaScript you're loading to say, do I need this? Can it be faster? Can it be smaller? Can I only load it in scenarios where I really need it? Like, let's only load the comment form JavaScript on blog posts that have comments enabled, that sort of logic. Okay, let's look at some better examples. There is no substitute for good hosting. When we look at those core Web Vitals metrics, they all measure the amount of time it takes essentially for the page to be ready and done. A big part of that process is all of the stuff that needs to happen between you clicking a link or typing URL, that message reaching a server where the website is hosted, and that hosting delivering the web page back. That is connecting to databases, loading WordPress, processing plugins, establishing themes, running through all of that logic. The best thing you can do to shave that bit of time down, the only real thing you can do effectively to do that at scale and cost effectively, is to have good hosting. And if you're spending less than, I don't know, $20 a month on hosting at the moment for your site, you're probably compromising on speed and performance, and not to mention security and other opportunities. Usually if you're not on good hosting and a system which is tailored and designed to run on WordPress and to take advantage of the latest versions of PHP and other WordPressy stuff, then there's no reason why your hosting and your backend should ever hold you up. You should be in a position where your entire website can load in under 500 or 600 milliseconds. It's rarely the case. Quite often, an average site on average hosting might take 2 or 3 seconds to load, when if it was on the right hosting setup, might take half of that. Yoast.com/WordPress-hosting. These are our recommendations of hosting companies which we regularly vet and review and categorize and assess. And we look at things like, what are the price ranges? Are they eco-friendly? Do they give back to the WordPress ecosystem and community? What versions of PHP do they support? Are they multilingual? And a bunch of other factors. In fact, I think Taco, who did a wonderful introduction earlier, does a whole load of that reviewing, and he knows that ecosystem very, very well. We don't get any money or any referrals from this ecosystem. We just believe that having good hosting is so important that really we want to take a lot of the effort out of that. Go and have a look. If you're not happy or thrilled with your current provider, make sure you have like an actual relationship with your hosting vendor, somebody you can phone and speak to, then you know that you're at least in the right ballpark. Okay, hosting done. Next, put a content delivery network in front of your website. I saw some questions come up earlier about this. Good work, getting on point. Our favorite content delivery network is Cloudflare. Others exist and are available and may be better for you depending on your setup. I recommend Cloudflare particularly a lot because A, it is incredibly powerful, and I'll come on to some examples of what that means in a minute, but also it's free, which is a good price point. They do have paid plans which unlock more shiny toys, but the free plan will get you from 0 to 9 out of 10, just as is, very, very quickly and easily. So if you're not familiar, what is this? How does it work? On the left is an example of how your website works without Cloudflare, like a normal website. People click on things and links and they type it in and they get the website. Some of those are legitimate users. Some of those are nasty people with bad agendas. Some of them are crawlers, and your website struggles and goes down occasionally. When you have Cloudflare, they sit in front of your website. This is how all CDNs work. Again, there are others, but I love Cloudflare. All of the requests to your site and to your pages and your content are routed through Cloudflare. It sits in front of your website. And that means that they can do a whole bunch of clever automatic optimization. For example, let's automatically minify all of our JavaScript and all of our CSS by ticking some boxes. Remember I said that things like loading smaller resources can have quite a big impact. Then let's make them smaller by automatically minifying them and stripping out unnecessary characters. This runs invisibly in the background. It runs perfectly, and you don't need to touch it. There are 1,000 things like this that Cloudflare does. This is one tiny example, and it really makes an enormous difference. One of the things they launched recently, which all of you lot should definitely check out, is their automatic platform optimization, or APO, for WordPress. This is an extremely powerful WordPress integration. You need the Cloudflare plugin. You turn it on. It costs $5 per month. Sounds like a terrible the sales pitch, but this is legitimately the most incredible technology in WordPress optimization at the moment. And it automatically adds a whole bunch of caching, management, resource optimization, specifically targeted at understanding how WordPress works. Like it understands if you're logged into the admin or not and behaves differently based on that. This is the best $5 per month you can invest. Even if you can't change your hosting and you're on bad hosting, this will radically transform your site's performance by sitting in front of all of that. Go check it out. They have loads of documentation. It's really, really good. I also mentioned software. And in our world, again, this means themes and plugins. I did want to take a moment to talk about plugins and the impact they can have. I want to dispel the myth first that there is such a thing as too many plugins. How many plugins should I have and how many plugins is okay is a complicated question. The right answer is the minimum number you need in order to make your theme do what you need it to do. That does mean that you need to review the functionality and the performance impact of every plugin you run. And I'll show you how to measure that in a moment. Because every plugin you add adds functionality. They do stuff, right? That's what they're for. That means that they have to run logic. Databases have to be queried and return responses. PHP has to decide whether it goes left or it goes right. All of these things take milliseconds. And when there's 100 of them, milliseconds add up. So you need to ask yourself, what impact does this plugin have on my front end? Like if it's adding JavaScript to every page that my users load, that's going to drag down your scores. What impact does it have on my server and my backend? If it's doing 1,000 database queries every time you load the admin page, which is more common than you might think, heavy backend stuff might slow down your front end for your users. For example, page builders are notoriously bad for performance because inherently the trade-off for allowing lots of drag and drop flexibility and freedom is lots of CSS and JavaScript to power that. These things aren't inherently bad, but there is a compromise in the same way there is a compromise with all plugins. So I'll come to some specific recommendations in a minute, but don't worry about having too many plugins. Don't worry about finding the perfect plugin, but do consider that every plugin that you add comes with a performance cost. Maybe it's small, maybe it's big, maybe it's back end or front end, and to try and look at that and evaluate it and decide the business case of is it worth losing 100 milliseconds in order to gain a fancy widget. How do you evaluate that? One of the easiest starting places is to use a plugin called Query Monitor, which if you haven't come across is great. You don't have to be massively technical. You don't have to be a developer. What this does is it gives you a big overview of all of the things that loaded on your page and color codes where there are problems. You can see in the screenshot here, there's a little drop down. I can't quite read what it says, but there's a red bit and there's a kind of orangey browny bit. Those are problems. And those will be broken database queries or 10 duplicate database queries, for example. And when you click on that, it will open it up and it will say this plugin was the cause of this, or this theme, or this line of code. And that's enough for you then to do a bit of detective work, to point a developer at it, to go to somewhere like Codable and hire somebody to fix it. You don't need to be a master of PHP and database logic to solve these things. You can just use these tools to find and identify where the problems and the bottlenecks are. I said I had some recommendations. There are lots of plugins designed to help you improve your page speed and your site speed. They range from image compression suites to clever CSS processing to full page caching to combinations of these and more. We recommend a few on Yoast.com, which we've used personally. We know are good, we know are stable, we know are performant, we know do the job they claim to do, but you should definitely do your own research here. These are a really good set. I really like WP Rocket, WP Total Cache, WP Optimize, the other ones that we list. These are a really good starting place. If you've not done any of this, if you've never looked at your site speed and you don't know where to start, dabble with some of these. Try a few, turn them on, turn them off. Many of them have many settings. You can explore and see how it behaves. Your site will behave differently because of all sorts of factors, including your hosting. Thinking of which, many of the better hosting companies have their own WordPress plugins as well. I know SiteGround have a really good one. I know ServeBolt have a really good one. They connect the hosting and the WordPress setup much more closely and intelligently and let you do some really clever stuff. Okay, so we've done the easy stuff. The combination of good hosting, a good CDN, and the right plugins is the easy side. For an example benchmark, if you've not touched site speed and you're currently scoring, say, 30 on page speed in sites, these steps alone might get you up to 60 or maybe even 70, depending on your site. That's a huge jump and definitely worth spending a day or two putting in place and working on. But the big wins, where you get into the green scores on that 75th percentile where you start getting success marks, requires some manual work. And that will be different for every site and every one of you. I'm afraid I can't give you a set of magic tips that will work for all of you, but I can tell you where to start. You go to your webpage. You, on Windows, press F12. I'm not sure what the equivalent is on Mac, but you open up Chrome's developer console, which is terrifying. Bear with me. Along the top, there are a series of tabs. You click on Network and you refresh your page, and it gives you something like this. This is every resource and asset that loads on this page, as seen by your Chrome browser as it loads it. And you can start to see some interesting things. Again, we don't have to understand this deeply. We just need to be able to spot problems and issues, which we can then either create JIRA tickets for, or hire a developer for, or talk to our developer team, or put some time aside to go and explore. We see things like this. We see things, my screen is tiny on my preview and I can't see what these lines say. There we go. We can see some interesting stuff jump out. Remember, we're doing detective work and sleuthing here. WPC7 front end, so redirect front end, that second bit I've highlighted. I know that we on Yoast.com run a contact form plugin called Contact Form 7, which many of you will have come across. And we have an add-on for that handles some clever redirecting. Why is that loading on the homepage? We don't have a comment form on the homepage because it's not a blog post and there is no comment form. But we are shipping 470-ish bytes of JavaScript at the cost of 33 milliseconds that could have been used by something else. You can see from those green bars that it's loading in parallel to other issues, but that's still resource and overhead that might have made something else slightly faster. Our action here is straightforward. We need to go and find out if there's a better way to load that plugin. Maybe it has a settings option in the WordPress admin area where we can check or uncheck. Maybe we need to add another plugin to conditionally manage where we do and don't load certain resources. Maybe we need to talk to a developer about the way it's been implemented in the theme, or whether they can add a filter or a hook to DQ it. All of these options will vary depending on what the issues you find are, but there's certainly enough evidence here that we can point the next steps and we can work out what to do. In fact, you can see further down, there's another thing this plugin's loading, a piece of JavaScript that we also don't need. This is quite an expensive oversight. There's 80 or so milliseconds of wasted time there that we could spend a few hours trying to recoup. Let's go a bit deeper. You can get really clever and add columns to this report. So you can right-click on these headers like name and status and add priority, Cloudflare's cache status, the originating domain, other stuff. Remember, we're looking for things which stand out. We're doing detective work. And you can see here some interesting things. Large JavaScript files, 33 kilobytes here, 25 there. A huge image. We're loading 112 kilobytes for Quick Wins Hero. And when you look at that, that's that big banner I mentioned earlier. No wonder our first Contentful Paint and largest Contentful Paint scores are poor, because that image is huge. We can use common image compression tools and plugins to shrink that down to maybe 50 or 60 kilobytes, something like Squish or You, which again we've linked to on that performance post in the previous slide, to go and shrink that down and improve our metrics. You don't need to be an expert here to fix the things. You just need to be an expert at going and looking for things which stand out, large numbers, slow timelines, etc. You can see at the bottom that Google Tag Manager is loading oddly. There's quite a big delay before it kicks in. You don't need to be able to read the matrix. We're just looking for clues, because when we see the clues, we can try and work out what these things are. We can see that this is Contact Form 7's add-on and then go back and say we know where the problem is. If you want to get really smart and really get in the weeds, you can pretend that you're on a mobile phone. There's a button I've highlighted up in the top left, which sets you into mobile mode. And you can change the emulation settings. Where I've highlighted at the top, I'm pretending to be on a fast 3G connection. This makes it really obvious where your mobile users will have bottlenecks. And it stretches out that timeline so you can go and investigate. These are the users who will have the worst experiences and drag down your scores. You need to find the slow stuff here and fix it first. You can see that we're loading WP Polyfill here, and it's taking 1.5 seconds. Why is that loading so early? Why is it loading for mobile users? Why is it loading above the fold? These are all questions we can ask, and then we can go and look at plugins or developer resources to try and change that, to say, maybe this doesn't need to load at all. Maybe it can load only after the user scrolls. We can start to make those decisions. If all of this sounds very complicated, and if you don't have the resources to go hunting around in your code because you're busy running your business, you can cheat, sort of. You can use AMP. AMP is a performance framework. It's a set of tools, components, and rules which help make fast sites by preventing you from doing the kinds of things that make sites slow. Like custom JavaScript is limited. There's a limit on how much CSS you can use. Images have to be loaded in certain ways. You can't use pop-ups until the user interacts with the page. AMP is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but with a bunch of rules. And if you follow those rules, it's surprisingly easy to make a very fast website, but at a potential trade-off of some functionality. For example, lots of WordPress sites, including ours, load messy, slow JavaScript as part of the plugins they use to deliver the functionality they want their users to have, to load widgets, to provide interactivity, submit forms. A lot of that will not work on AMP unless those plugins are coded exceptionally well and have considered AMP. They might not work. So you might struggle to find comparable alternatives to power your site and make it work the way you want it to, or have to make compromises on your design, on the way you convert, on the way that you attract traffic, and so on. You can try AMP out using the AMP plugin, which is made by Google and Automatic and a bunch of contributors. And this tries to automatically convert your theme to be AMP compliant. Your mileage will vary. It will automatically disable bad JavaScript, inlines, optimize all sorts of stuff that it shouldn't do. It will automatically, optimize your CSS and your images. It automatically optimizes all of your markup and preloads images and 1,000 small things, much like Cloudflare, but much closer to your site. I think this is great. My site uses AMP via this plugin, but I am heavily biased. I'm part of the AMP advisory committee and have some small say in the roadmap and direction that AMP goes, which means I'm definitely in favor of this. But I'm involved in that because I think AMP is awesome. It is worth noting, however, that even AMP comes with a performance cost, because you have to load JavaScript from an external domain in order to make AMP work. And I've seen some questions in the Q&A about this. If you're running AMP to make your site super fast, you might find that some of the testing tools complain about the way it loads JavaScript. That is a problem. It's a known limitation of the format, and there are some changes coming later in 2021 to fix that. If this sounds too good to be true, I know AMP gets a lot of mixed reviews and a lot of mixed experiences, mostly because people don't like the constraints. A lot of common plugins don't work with it, so you might need to change about how you manage and run your site and how you convert users. But it can be done. You really can dial your site up to 11 without doing the worrying and worrying about the doing of most of the stuff that I've talked about. To prove this, I took a week off work in January and I rebuilt my website. This is WordPress behind Cloudflare, hosted by Surfbolt, with the AMP plugin and some basic SEO. It looks great, I think. More importantly, it's lightning fast. And more importantly, perhaps, it almost cripplingly close scores 100 on the Lighthouse Core Web Vitals test. It's 100 on desktop, but 94 on mobile. It's so close. Unfortunately, the big image of me on the homepage is quite large, even on mobile. And if I try to make it smaller, it looks a bit rubbish. That's interesting. I might have to make compromises on my design in order to be faster. And that's a business question. Do I think that trade-off is good? Is 100 milliseconds worth people not recognizing me when that? It's an interesting exploration. You will have to make similar trade-offs and considerations when you start to make your site faster. Maybe you can't have Elementor powering an enormous slider on your homepage. Maybe you just can't. Maybe you need an alternative. So I'm waiting for AMP to make some improvements later in the year to reduce that total blocking time to get me up to 100. If you want to try and get this close to 100, try the AMP plugin. It's really worth a go, albeit you might have to compromise on some business decisions. That is almost everything. We are going to go over to questions. We did have a few questions. People submitted some questions in advance, some of which were really good. I see Taka is just rejoining us. Yep. I figure, Taka, come on back in. Let's have a chat, and I will start with some of the ones that we had submitted in advance, if we like.
Yeah. So first of all, take a breath, because this was like 45 minutes non-stop, Jono. Meanwhile, for everyone listening, please go to the Ask a Question section and upvote your favorite questions. There's currently almost 70 of them. I'm not sure we can answer all, so make sure that your favorite question has all the upvotes, and then we'll start at the top and work our way down as far as we can. And you had some.
I've just, in the meantime, just seen a bunch of people asking about the Chrome console. If F12 doesn't work for you on you're not on Windows, you can right-click the page and hit Inspect. That'll bring that up there.
Yep. And I think Simon has been sharing the Mac shortcut as well several times.
Oh, nice. Good work. Okay. So we had a few really interesting questions that I pulled out beforehand. This was one of the, and I've consolidated some of these where there were common themes, but this was a great question. I'm going to butcher people's pronunciation. Sorry, from Wilfredo Luis Sania Russell, maybe, saying Wilfredo's been experimenting with using CSS to replace some images. Because if you're using for things like gradients and patterns, because it looks like you can speed your site up because you're removing an image. This is a really interesting point that's worth exploring. If your theme has images in it which are mostly just kind of big blocks of color or patterns or small icons or up arrows or just the kind of lines and shapes, you might find that using CSS to describe and present those rather than images can have a huge impact. Every image that your site and your page loads has to negotiate with the server, has to download it, has to understand it, has to present it. CSS is loaded much sooner in the chain. It's much smaller, can be much more efficient. Anywhere where you can use CSS instead of images is definitely a good shout. Good question. This one came up a lot. We had a lot of flavors of this question. Why does my score change over time, right? Why do I get two different scores in one day when nothing's really changed? It went from 79 to 6, back up to 86, nothing changed. This is a great question. And there are a few things that are happening here, because I'm sure as many of you test, you'll see similar things. Firstly, depending on your WordPress site, so depending on your setup, your WordPress site might be faster or slower at different times. That doesn't sound hugely intuitive, but think about server loads, how many visitors you have right now, scheduled processes running in the background, requests to third-party resources, the weather. All of these can introduce big variations. Secondly, and I don't think this is the case here, but the metrics aren't set in stone. This is version 1 of Core Web Vitals, and the measurements are going to continually change and evolve and improve. And in fact, every week or so, new tweaks and fixes go out in how accurately and how cleverly they measure these metrics. So you might have had a really good score, or it might have had a really bad score that was misreported, and the improvements to the way they measure it now change that score. So these aren't set in stone. We need to be continually optimizing them. Lastly, I mentioned there are two different sources for data. There's the lab data where they try and estimate and measure. And then there's the real field data from human beings out in the real world. Field data has two big moving parts. It's people from everywhere in all sorts of different scenarios and all sorts of different devices and connections. People on old mobile phones accessing your site from the other side of the world might influence your metrics. And secondly, the numbers are an average over the last 30 days. So there's a lag from any changes that you make both on your site and in the audience. So your numbers will change. They will probably be erratic. They shouldn't be that different. So there's something weird going on maybe, but they will always be changing, and you should always optimize for the lab data, so for the field data, and continue to improve that for all of your users wherever and whatever they are. Nice. Okay, should we harvest?
Yes.
Wow, we've had 50 questions.
Well, actually, there's a load more button at the bottom, so there's 80 currently.
Wow.
Meanwhile, in the chat, I had a chance to slide in our post on sliders. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. Let's start with the, well, by far most popular question. I've heard that embedding videos in a post is really good for SEO, but I've also noticed it really slows down page loads. Should we stop embedding videos?
Oh, that's difficult, right? You don't want to be trading off SEO and users, like if the videos are useful. So most of the native ways that you can embed videos are annoyingly slow. There are clever tricks you can do. So something we do on Yoast.com is when we have a video in the content, we use a bit of JavaScript to, well, we load the thumbnail of that image, of that video, and then when you click it, it loads the video and replaces it. So the video doesn't load immediately. It only loads when you click play. We have some clever JavaScript that does that. I think, and somebody kill me if I get this wrong, I think we might be trying to do some work on getting that into the Gutenberg video block so that just becomes part of the way that works. That would make a lot of sense. I think Ari on our team might even be looking at that because that feels like best practice. You don't want to be loading the enormous video. Like reams of YouTube cookies and third-party stuff is nasty. So if you can and you have the resource, look into, I can't remember the name of the technique, but tweet us afterwards. I'll find it. And if that's a bit scary, then wait until we fix it in WordPress.
All right. Thank you. So the most popular question for quite a while today was, my site scores 91 for speed on desktop, but only 51 on mobile. Why such a huge difference?
Yeah, I think we covered that a bit. That's mostly because the networks are slower, like 3G. Mobile includes users on a much broader variety of devices, many of which will have worse network connections than a desktop equivalent. 3G is going to be slower than a Wi-Fi connection. Every image you load, every server connection you make, every bit of CSS that loads will take longer to load. JavaScript in particular, JavaScript is really computationally expensive to run. Your fancy laptop will blitz through it. Your mobile phone will chug like a steam train. So things that feel fast on desktop might actually be really slow on mobile devices. So yeah, you've got to work much harder to make mobile faster.
All right. So, and another question we already touched on a bit is, are there any good WordPress plugins to help with speeding up a site?
Yep, and yeah, we had a resource in the deck, and I think yoast.com/recommended plugins or something similar. There's a link in the deck.
Yeah, it should be there.
I really like either WP Rocket or W3 Total Cache. They do the same kind of thing. They're very different plugins and approaches. Auto Optimize is nice. WP Optimize is nice. There's a few others, but the easiest, best one is Cloudflare. Get Cloudflare running in front of your site. Use the Cloudflare plugin. And that will do a whole bunch of heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, for those who don't follow our monthly webinar, we are mentioning Cloudflare every single time, and we're still not sponsored. So this is purely because they're good and not because we're sponsored by Cloudflare in any way. So the next question is one I can answer. I like that. Yes, this webinar is going to be recorded and it will be sent to all of you. It will also be available on yoast.com/webinar. Let's get back to speed questions. How does Google handle lazy loaded questions? Is the speed score
lazy loaded questions? Lazy loaded images.
Images. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
so
you lazily
loaded
that question.
Yes.
That's a great question.
Images. Is the speed score after all the content, including the lazy loaded images, are loaded?
Good question. So there's a few moving parts here. One, it depends how they're being lazy loaded. So if you're using like an old school legacy approach that uses JavaScript, it could be anyone's guess. If you're using modern lazy loading approaches, which WordPress does automatically most of the time with most plugins, then you should be okay. So in fact, almost all of your Core Web Vitals scores are particularly relating to the content you see on screen when it first loads. And your lazily loaded stuff, therefore, should be loading because it's on the screen. So it'll be done. It will consider it when it's loaded in. You're looking for when all that stops moving and is done. So the lazy loading stuff that's below the fold won't impact performance, but the stuff that's on screen immediately will, because it should.
All right. And what is the best option for serving next-gen images like WebP?
Great question. Easy answer, Cloudflare. So conventionally, you might spend an hour thinking, should this be a JPEG or should it be a PNG or should it be a WebP, except that Safari doesn't have great support for WebP. And you might even go with a Viv, AVIV, which is the new format, which is 10 times better than WebP, but support isn't great yet. And you might do a PNGA, which has, there are lots of different formats of images and there are lots of shiny new ones. It's really impractical to try and manage the logic for the WordPress already generates lots of different sizes of images. You don't also want it generating lots of different formats because you just fill up your server. Let Cloudflare do this automatically. They detect whether the user supports it. They automatically transform it. They cache it. This isn't something you should be fighting with.
All right. Your internet connection kind of struggled a bit there, but I think the answer was clear to everyone. All right, so let me see. How do loads of redirects, like a lot via the Yoast plugin, impact site speed?
Nice. There's been a load of research done into this. Generally, not a lot. Lots of redirects definitely can harm site speed when you have millions of them. If you have less than, I don't know, 100,000, I wouldn't worry about it too much. And for big sites and old sites, it's actually quite common to say, oh, actually, we've got 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 redirects have built up over time. Maybe you had lots of products or stuff changed. This isn't the end of the world. Do, however, manage them. I see a little comment in response to that question, which was quite interesting. Should we retire these? Should we kill them? Audit it occasionally, but I would definitely try and keep them for as long as you can. Google and Bing especially will continue to request old URLs, links from other sources. Users might have stuff bookmarked still. Those type of redirects get hit for years and 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 years. So if you can keep them and they're not having a discernible impact, which they shouldn't if there's fewer than, I don't know, 20,000, then don't worry about it.
That's a clear answer. It's definitely something that a lot of people worry about. We see that in support as well at Yoast. People are worried about the number of redirects when they have a few hundred.
Yeah, a few hundred is fine.
All right. What speeds should we aim for both mobile and desktop?
Ooh, 100. Aim for 100.
Aim for the stars.
Aim for the stars. No, so I guess the practical answer is you need, I think off the top of my head, 75% to get green, and you need that on each of the scores in order to qualify for the ranking boost. But aim for 100 because the scores are going to change. I don't know if this is official, but I know that the criteria for scoring that high will get harder. This is going to be a moving goalpost. So aim for 100.
All right. And what did you get if they beat JonoAlderson.com?
We will send treats, definitely.
All right. So post your pictures to Twitter and tweet them at Jono Alderson. We'll make that happen.
Yep.
All right. How do you have a visually interesting site with images, videos, etc. that look appealing on 4K high-def monitors and still load quickly?
Good question. So one of the things that WordPress does surprisingly well is it generates a lot of different sizes of an image. So if you upload a really big image, you get a small version, a medium version, a large version, etc. as well as, so not only does it lazy load that intelligently, most themes will take advantage of WordPress's source set capabilities, which will communicate all the different versions that are available to the browser, and the browser will load the most appropriate one based on the viewport size and the detected capabilities of the browser. So it will say, this is a huge screen, this is a 4K device, serve the big one, we're fine. Or it'll say it's a tiny mobile screen, we should only serve the 300 pixel one. You can go and debug that in the Chrome console window that I talked about earlier. You can see where it's doing that. You can get a feel for if it's working or not. You want to go even further. Cloudflare has a feature only on the business plan, which I think is $200 or euros a month, that they can automatically resize images on the edge. So then you can take that WordPress functionality and you can say, actually, there are 100 versions of my image, serve the perfect fit for the perfect device and the perfect resolution, and WordPress will handle that quite gracefully.
All right. So meanwhile, after posting this little competition here, I see that some of our attendees are already thinking about cheating and photoshopping results. Nice. Don't worry, we will verify the results, so there's no cheating here. Is Yoast going to offer a speed plugin?
No, mostly of two reasons why not. One is we offer a very good SEO plugin that takes a team of 120-ish something people, keeps them very busy with our own existing roadmap. But the other is focus and prioritization. There are some plugins in this space that are phenomenally good, like WP Rocket. They do a great job. It's not valuable for us to reinvent their wheel and to distract our team who are busy doing SEO stuff. And in fact, many of the best caching and performance plugins have integrations with Yoast. We partner really nicely. That would not be a good plan for us.
All right, so let me see what other questions there are. If you see your question in the Q&A section and it doesn't have enough upvotes to make it to the top, please dive in, upvote, because we will just handle them one by one. And we are now at, do sliders or animated headers or videos impact largest contentful paint or cumulative layout shift?
Oh, yeah.
And if so, are there ways to optimize these?
That's a great question. Yeah, they really, really can. So quite often those are large images. Quite often they load in slowly because they take a lot of JavaScript. They're like things like Revolution Slider, Elementor. They are quite heavy. There's lots of complicated HTML and CSS. They are slow to initially load, and then they're a bit janky. They also impact things like first input delay. First input delay. I can't interact and slide with that until it's done janking around. Your mileage will vary based on your site and which sliders you're using and how they're implemented. Typically, you want to try and load smaller images, maybe load a static image, and only start loading the slider functionality when that's finished and the page is done. But you're going to be getting quite deep and technical by then. So maybe try and cope without it. I think Takazot, you've already linked to it, but we feel really strongly, and I know that it's generally becoming user experience design best practice, that sliders are evil. Sliders are what happens when your senior stakeholders can't agree what your page is for and you try and make it everything for everyone. I would double down on having one strong message. I mean, this is straying away from speed advice into user experience advice, but try and not rely on sliders. Say one thing and say it strong.
All right. I've shared the link once again, so anyone can go to yoast.com/opinion on sliders and read the full story on why they should get rid of them. Do you have any recommendations for sites built using visual page builders?
Great question. Yes. So I know Elementor are doing a ton of work on speed, and they're struggling, from what, not in a bad way, but it's hard to make that kind of technology fast because of the way it works. You offer flexibility, you introduce CSS and JavaScript. That's very hard to decouple. They are doing a ton of work to try and improve that. You can mitigate some of that by putting something like WP Rocket and Cloudflare in front of it, and that will reduce some of the damage. The most interesting option, I think, is maybe looking at what Google are doing with web stories. It's not quite a page builder, but increasingly the stuff that they're doing is much more performant than many of the page builders out there. If you haven't come across this, it's think Instagram stories, but built in WordPress via Gutenberg on AMP, which is a bit of an interesting direction to go in, but it's Instagram for WordPress, and that's quite performant. That's worth looking at.
I'm not sure a lot of people can follow, so can you tweet out the link after the webinar?
That's a good plan.
I mean, that was a lot of platforms combined into one thing.
There we go.
All right. Yes. Perfect. Web Stories plugin. That is. It's in the chat, by the way, so you don't have to go to Twitter to find it. Okay, I'm going to cherry pick a few questions now because I'm seeing some duplications. So upvoting didn't catch all of that. But there was a very interesting question. Yes, here. My page feels fast, but Lighthouse values are bad. GT metrics shows good values. What the heck?
Oh, I lost you there. So GT metrics is a different measurement tool. It does use some of the Lighthouse scoring. I would check that you are measuring mobile. If you're just using it on desktop and it feels fast, then maybe it's fast on desktop, but not on mobile. Otherwise, remember that the Core Web Vitals metrics are from real users who may be on the other side of the world from you. If you live next door to where your website is hosted, then it might be quite fast. But somebody from the other side of the planet who has to hop through all these different servers and limited by the speed of light might take another 3 seconds for it to load. That's another thing that Cloudflare is quite good at, incidentally, so that you can serve it from somewhere nearby. Geography is a big factor when it comes to speed for people who aren't near your site.
So I have another question for you here. Would clearing my cache speed up my site?
Probably not. So the way caches work is, let's imagine you load a site. The server wakes up, WordPress loads, the page is produced, the database does stuff, all of the images get downloaded, and it goes, boom, here's a page. A caching engine says, actually, we already did this. Don't need to run all those processes again. We can just take the finished product and go, boom, here's the page. Really fast. Everything, all the logic is pre-run. Everything is just serving a saved version. You occasionally will want to clear the cache to generate a new version of that. You might have changed some content or updated a plugin, and you don't want people to get the old version. So clearing your caches is going to reset things. And then the next people who hit that will get a slow experience because they're having to load the WordPress and load the plugins and load the theme before it recaches again. So caching great, caching make fast, clearing cache slows you down.
That's a clear answer. Let me quickly answer that you can upvote in the Ask a Question section. And there it is. Mark mentioned, isn't AMP on its way out? And he linked to a resource that says the end of AMP.
Yeah, I read that article. No, AMP is stronger than ever. There is some interesting... So the thing that's changing is that as of May, I've forgotten exactly when, you will no longer need to be on AMP in order to be eligible for the top stories carousel results in Google. So at the moment, if you're like a news site and you want to rank in that carousel along the top of the search results, you have to be on AMP. Soon that will no longer be the case. That aside, AMP is still a growing, flourishing standard. It's still doing pretty awesome stuff. The article referenced is by the CTO of a company called Ezoic, who have a vested interest in not liking AMP and not liking front-end performance. I won't get into the politics too much, but yeah, there's some conflicts of interest at play there.
All right. So do you have an exact date for when Core Web Vitals will become essential for the boost?
No, but I'm frantically Googling.
Somewhere May, right?
May 2021. I didn't think they'd set a date, and I don't see any evidence of that. That's a whole month, but it's soon.
Yeah, so assume 1st of May.
Yeah, quite possibly. They're like round numbers and tidy schedules.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to aim for like the 20th and then start optimizing on the 18th. So.
Oh gosh, no. And again, like all of this affects real commercial metrics. So start optimizing yesterday.
Right. Yeah. So you don't have to like wait until Google requires this, but it's already important today.
Yeah.
All right. So what do you say? Shall we do like 3 or 4 more questions?
Yeah, I reckon so. There's still some interesting stuff in here, I think.
Yeah, there is. There's also a very lively chat going on. I only have 2 eyes, and my 2 eyes can only focus on one specific spot on my screen. So if you have a question, do post it in the Q&A section, and please don't use the chat because I just can't keep up today. Let's see what we have for amazing questions here.
I've got a good one. I'd quite like to. Oh, can I pick one?
Yes, you can.
Rachel
Absolutely.
C says, any possibility of Google looking at a specific user base for my website? She says her customers are primarily desktop, so it's frustrating that she gets bad scores when only 15% of her users access her site via mobile. My audience are desktop. Why should I be scored badly for mobile? Well, this is really important. This is really important for SEO, not just speed. Those other people who aren't your audience, who are on mobile or in a different country, still might want or need to read your content, still might benefit from your advice or information, still might link to you, still might retweet something funny you post, still might influence or cite or recommend you to somebody who else might be their consumer. We really need to avoid, as digital marketers, thinking I only need to market to this particular demographic in this location on these devices. You need to market to everybody and influence them. Content marketing needs to be broad, needs to be a wide audience, and your speed is no different. So yeah, like almost all of Yoast.com's traffic is desktop, because we're a bit of a weird edge case given that you don't really manage your WordPress site on a mobile. But we still have to optimize for mobile because Google calls mobile. A lot of our content is read on mobile, even though that's not where we make our conversions and our money particularly. So yeah, sorry.
All right. So meanwhile, I see a few questions where if the Q&A will also be shared after today, and the answer is probably yes. And they will be in the full replay for sure. So yoast.com/webinar after today, and you can find all of the questions, answers, and pause Jono, so you can write down what he says, because boy, you're talking fast today.
We've got a lot to get through.
All right, so let me see if there are other upvoted questions. Let me scroll back to the top. Yes, there is a quite popular one that we sort of touched on already. What image format is the best for a website? And what's the maximum size an image can have?
Sizes are interesting. So format, yeah, we touched on format. The best format for a website is the fastest, newest format that particular user can support in their browser, which is a decision you should leave to Cloudflare, really. Maximum image size is an interesting one. So as of WordPress 5.5, I think, they now automatically shrink your image to about 2,400 pixels on each side. So there's no point uploading a 20 megabyte, 5,000 megapixel image, because it will crash your server before it even gets shrunk down. But I would try and upload larger images than you might think you need, because Google Discover, for example, needs a minimum of 1,200 wide by 667 pixels. Facebook prefers, will support smaller ones, but prefers the larger ones for different views. It's probably worth trying to upload things which are about 2,000 by 2,000 maybe, or whatever the equivalent ratio is. Any smaller than that and you're maybe missing out on some formats and some options, especially considering that users on modern mobile phones have retina screens which display twice the pixel density. So you need to have a version of the image available in WordPress which is twice the pixel size of the space it's going to be displayed in. So if you've got a 600 pixel wide slot you want an image in, you need to feed WordPress a 1,200 pixel image and let it do all the resizing.
All right. So this is actually a good question. If you use the PageSpeed Insights and it's not reporting field data, what's up with that? What does that mean?
Nice. So you do need enough people to have browsed your website and to be browsing it actively in order for Google to provide field data stats. I don't know what the specific thresholds are. I don't think they've said, but it's enough that they can do calculations. When they don't have field data, either for a subset of URLs, let's say you get loads of traffic to your blog, but none to your product pages, they will use the stats from your blog to make an estimate about your product pages. So where they're missing data, they will try and fill in the blanks. When there's no data, you're kind of stuck with the lab data and them guessing that it's going to be loosely close. It might even be worth running some paid ad campaigns to get some traffic to your site just to see how it performs in the real world. There's nothing wrong with buying traffic through mechanisms that aren't SEO to try and explore and see how it behaves.
Actually, I think on yoast.com/podcast, there's a very interesting podcast that touches on SEO and SEA.
Nice.
So that would be worth checking out as well. I think I can remember her name. That was Yoast and Christy, I think.
Oh, nice.
Talking about.
I've just seen some comments in the chat I wanted to pull out saying that,
sure.
Didn't expect a recommendation to have every image be 2,000 pixels wide in the speed webinar. I get it completely. So the image you should display to the user should be the right size for that spot, and it should be as small and compressed and minified as possible. However, you also want to load the right size for the space it's in. And I mentioned earlier, WordPress generates lots of different sizes of each image you upload. So if you feed it a large image as like your origin image, your main image, WordPress can then make and use the smaller images to fit the spaces it needs to quite intelligently. Usually most themes and plugins will do a good job of that, but you want to make sure it's got a good sized image as a starting point.
All right. Given that we are well over time, I'm going to show a little button at the bottom of the screen, because this is not the only webinar that we'll be doing here at Yoast. Next week, Tuesday, on April 13th, at least in our time zone, there will be another webinar that's touching on video SEO. So if you want to learn more about video SEO, do subscribe. There's a button at the bottom of your screen right now that you can click and subscribe to that awesome webinar. That won't be Jono, will it?
I'll be there, but I'm not the star of the show. The star of the show is my very good friend Phil Nottingham, who is the indisputable king of video SEO and increasingly kind of video branding and how to use video in your digital marketing strategy to build your brand and your business. He's an absolute rock star, really understands the space. I'm really looking forward to that one. Yeah, I'll be sat in Taco's seat for that one and having to just watch along.
Yeah, which is a good place to be in, because this was a lot of fun. I can see there are many more questions. Of course, we'll have our regular blog post on yoast.com. So if you want to stay up to date on everything SEO, do subscribe for our newsletter. Do visit yoast.com every day, because we'll be trying to keep you posted on all the latest news. And definitely do go to yoast.com/webinar, because we have a monthly SEO webinar where Jono and Yoast, the founder of Yoast, this is highly confusing, talk about all the news in SEO world. So that's definitely one that you don't want to miss either.
Nice.
With that,
do tweet us.
Jono. Yes, oh, absolutely. If you have any follow-up questions, do tweet, and we'll try our best to answer all of them. If you liked today, and I know I promised this would be completely for free, but hey, if you like us, take a look at Yoast SEO Premium, because it's an amazing product and it will give you access to our Yoast SEO Academy.
Yes.
So
smart.
That's another place to learn more about SEO. Jono, thank you so much for today, and
Thank you,
see
Taco.
you again soon.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.